So this meeting is being recorded, and so we really appreciate Mattie Engel and Margaret Baudinet.
Close enough.
Thanks for being here and educating us all on this. We will have an opportunity for questions and answers towards the end, and if there's something that we do not get to, and there's a lot of kind of consensus around these questions, then we can answer those. And if I can't answer anything, they can answer those in future follow-up correspondences. So please use the chat feature for your questions throughout this time. I am the director of alumni programs at Pitzer College, and I'm very thrilled to read the bios and do the introductions for Mattie and Margaret. Mattie Engel graduated Pitzer in 2012 with a degree in English and World Literature and Creative Writing and a minor in Spanish. She also holds 10 years of admissions experience from Pitzer and Colorado College, specializing in equity, access, and the on-campus visitation experience. She's read over 15,000 college applications and now serves as a senior college counselor for College Solutions. She's the proud mother of a 2-year-old son and lives in Colorado, where they just recently got In-N-Out Burger. She strives to keep students on track through a highly organized process that identifies and meets students where they are. Margaret Bolton Baudinet, apologies for saying it a little bit wrong, is the owner and chief executive officer of College Solutions. Originally from Alabama, Margaret graduated from the University of Virginia with a degree in political and literary thought, finishing her academic tenure with research at Oxford University. She has 5 years of admissions experience with UVA, specializing in legacy admissions. She's worked as an independent education consultant for 10 years and served on the selection committees for the Coca-Cola Scholars Foundation and UVA's Jefferson Scholarship Foundation. Margaret is the proud mother of a 7-year-old quintuplets and a new baby girl, and she lives in a location where they don't have In-N-Out Burger. As a mother and college advisor, she strives to see the whole person, motivation, fears, blind spots, and goals. Mattie, I kick it over to you.
So thank you, Justin, for introducing us. Margaret's actually going to start us off here, and then I'll jump in a second here. So,
Cool. Well, thanks for having us. We're really excited to be here, and we're thankful for the opportunity. As Justin said, I do have quintuplets. There are 7, so hopefully they are safely brushing their teeth by now because it's 7 o'clock on the East Coast, but you never know. But glad to be here with you guys. I just want to open this by saying that this is meant to answer your questions and, anything that you have on your brain about college admission that you want us to address, let us know. We are open books. Mattie and I love what we do. So we want this to be helpful to you. So give us anything you got. We're game for it. First thing I think we'd like to share is that we want families to understand coming into the college admissions process, really with any college, because we spend our time as college consultants kind of analyzing how a variety of colleges admit students. And it seems like most colleges, if not all, are considering context from which a student comes as part of their admissions file. So we're reminding families that we talk to really across the world that colleges are first going to look at what's called a school profile from your high school. And a school profile is basically a fact sheet from the student's high school, and it details the kinds of curricula that's offered. So AP, IB, honors, anything in between, all the way down to what counts as an A, what counts as a B. Do you even have grades at your school? Some schools just have written evaluations. Some schools rank students of top 10%, top 20%. And then some schools will also detail how diverse their school is, what percentage are going to 4-year institutions versus vocational programs. So it's really just a nice way for colleges to get a bird's eye view of what kind of education is happening at the institution. If you haven't seen it for your child's high school, go ask the school counselor. It's usually on the school website, but if it's not, you can see it. Sometimes I know I've made recommendations on ways to improve school profiles because high schools will say, what are we missing? And I'm glad to offer advice. So if you ever want to send us one, I'm always happy to tell you what it's missing. But we remind students that you are always evaluated in the context from which you come. So if the school offers AP classes, one would think that a student would take advantage of that to the best of their ability. It is not something where students are expected to be perfect all the time, unless you're looking at an Ivy League school, and then, who knows, but if you're looking at the other schools, then the idea is that you're taking the most difficult curricula that makes sense for you, the student, or for your child. Some families will say, is AP better than IB? What if there are post APs offered? We're glad to answer any of those questions. I will use my students that I counsel here on the East Coast as an example. We typically take AP classes on the East Coast, and some students will admit that some AP classes are easier than other AP classes. They don't want to talk about it when their parents are around, because parents start to get really nervous of like, wait a minute, are we in the easy APs? A few easy APs is fine. It's when students stack up all the easy APs in senior year that you typically get dinged for it. An example of an easy AP would be AP statistics. So AP statistics and typically AP calculus are offered at most colleges that subscribe to the AP curriculum. Most parents would say AP stats is useful. I use stats in my everyday life. Absolutely, take AP stats. Even at students who are interested in business, parents are very inclined to get their kids into AP statistics. I usually start waving my hands and stomping my feet so students won't do this, because most colleges don't teach pre-calculus. They start with calculus. So if a student hasn't had some level of calculus in high school, it can be considered a detriment to their success in a college environment. So if calc is offered at a student's high school and it's not going to ruin them personally, emotionally, then I think it's worth considering. But I think these are things that parents come into the process thinking, oh, I got this. We're going to take, AP classes. We're going to get ready for our career. Yeah, but there are some things that colleges consider really important that are not sometimes shared with the general public. So we try to make it our job just to tell everybody who will listen, so you don't get dinged for something that you didn't even know existed. Maddie, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I also think you brought up a little bit about the IB program, and that's also offered at some institutions or some high schools. And oftentimes, if a school has AP classes or if the school has IB classes, there's no one system that's better than the other. A college just wants to see that the student is pursuing rigor appropriately for them, whatever the student can handle. So, yeah, I think Margaret touched it. There's just a bunch of different curriculum out there that students can pursue, and colleges are generally just looking for them to pursue rigor when they can. Margaret, do you want to talk about class rank?
Sure. So the other things to think about, some families will say, everybody in our high school is smart. We certainly have, magnet programs and all kinds of really cool opportunities. I will encourage families to look at the school profile and see what the high school says. So sometimes a high school will say, the top 10% of our students have between a 3.7 and a 4.0 GPA. And then the next 15% have between this and this GPA. Ideally, you're trying to be in the top. I always tell my students, you don't have to be at the top, but you need to be in the top. In the top depends on the school. So we really encourage students to consider what school they're coming from, especially if you go to a boarding school or an online school. We had a student who was a professional equestrian a couple years ago, and she took all of her classes online. She never knew really any of her fellow students because it was an individual kind of tutoring program. So she had no class rank and all written evaluations, but she's probably going to ride in the Olympics from the next go round, and got into George Washington with no problems. So there's no wrong way to be ranked in a class. It's all about what the numbers mean. So just look at that when you're applying to college and consider kind of what your high school is saying about the students who apply from the school. The last thing I'd love to touch on is region. I think most colleges would agree with me when they say they want kind of somebody from everywhere. They think that diversity really makes a first-year class. We call it a first-year class at UVA, but it's also called a freshman class. But diversity makes a freshman class really what it is. And there are some schools who are going to prioritize certain areas because they want more students from that area. When I worked at Virginia, it was always New Mexico and Nevada. If anybody could find anybody from New Mexico or Nevada that wanted to come to UVA, gold star by your name in the admissions office. That's not to say that those kids weren't qualified. They were, but a lot of those students choose to stay in state or they choose to go to vocational school. So it just didn't make sense for a lot of those families to come all the way to Charlottesville, Virginia. Um, I tell students all the time, you are typically more attractive further away from home because colleges have plenty of students from closer to home. So think about, if your student is ready for that step, consider schools that might be a little bit further away. I imagine parents are shaking their heads of like, be quiet, Margaret. I want to keep my kids close. But sometimes going further away can make a student more attractive simply because they represent a piece of geographic diversity that may be meaningful to a college.
Thanks, Margaret. I was going to mention that I'm from Maui, Hawaii, and I ended up at Pitzer, and so maybe that was a compelling element as part of my admissions application. But yes, context is everything. We're going to move on to another subject here. Test optional doesn't mean optional. What does that mean here? Many colleges are now test optional because of COVID, which has left many students wondering if they can get out of taking all tests. The answer for us is no. We advise students that they still need to take them. So a little context here. Before 2020, the college admissions world was toying with this idea of test optional. Of course, most of you here probably know that Pitzer moved into a test optional environment in 2003. There was a study that showed that there was no correlation between academic success at Pitzer and standardized testing performance. Pitzer, being the pioneer that it is in this type of way, was the first college on the West Coast to adopt an SAT optional admission policy. And then along with the UCs in 2022, they went test blind, which means that even if a student scores well on the SAT or the ACT, they actually can't submit it to those institutions that are test blind. I know University of San Diego is another institution that's test blind. Data, of course, is out there to be interpreted still because this is such a novel concept for a lot of places, but places like the University of Connecticut, they've said that becoming test optional has created a more diverse class. However, as we know, especially at Pitzer, testing has been proved to be skewed by race and affluence, and the latter category being able to afford test prep heavily. So it's problematic, as we know. When COVID necessitated that colleges move into a test optional environment, most schools went test optional, except for a few exceptions, military academies, Florida schools, they remained that you needed to submit testing. There were mixed reviews overall. The test optional admissions policy causes applications to increase. So some schools have shifted to a permanent policy, and then some like MIT are like, nope, we want to see all tests. Often the mandate for test scores comes from outside of the admission office. So, faculty and VPs who want applications to increase, especially when rankings mean something. And I'm speaking generally as this varies from college to college, but overall, we still believe that a student should take a standardized test for a few reasons. Not all colleges are test optional. You might have seen this in the news recently, but Dartmouth and Yale, they're reactivating their standardized testing requirements. And then places like Georgetown, University of Florida, Georgia Tech, they're among a list of schools that still require testing. So it's better just to take a test because not all schools are test optional. A little thing here, if you take the SAT and ACT, you can qualify as a National Merit Scholarship finalist. And then we just think, well, this is how we advise our students, if you end up taking the SAT and ACT and you end up doing well, that's something that's going to be additive to your application in general. So better just to take it, even though a lot of schools are test optional. And as we've been seeing, obviously things are starting to change now, so it's just best for students to take it. What I've also seen too is that even though schools are saying they're test optional, they're also admitting students at different rates, depending on if they submit a score or not. So there are these schools out there that are test neutral, and that means that they don't care whether or not you submit testing. This was very much the case when I worked at Colorado College. We would award each of our students an academic rating based on their grades and their test scores. And if the student did not submit test scores, then that academic rating was calculated just based on their transcript. So we are a test neutral institution. But there are other places out there that are test aware, which means if you submit a test, you get somewhat of an advantage in the admissions process. And if you, there are other schools that are test preferred, like Georgetown, where if you admit a score, you get like a 90% advantage in getting into a place like Georgetown. So important to know about how testing is evaluated in this process. We recommend a student send their test score to a college if they fall within the middle 50% range of scores from students who are admitted at that institution. So for schools that are test optional, students still have a choice about whether or not to submit it. Students will also want to determine if a test score is a plus factor on their application. So what this means is that, you know, does this test score reflect how they're doing academically in their high school? If a student maybe has straight A's, but then they have a 1050 out of 1600 on the SAT, we'd probably then advise that the student not send. I mean, I know we would advise the student not send that score to a test optional school. So, you know, there needs to be alignment with the transcript. And then, of course, for colleges that practice holistic admission, even if the student is to send their score, it's only one component of the myriad of other elements that schools are assessing. My colleague at Pitzer, actually, he used to always say a test score isn't a person, which still sticks with me. So yeah, it's just one component. Of course, now Pitzer's test blind, so nobody would be saying that in that office. So yeah, important to take it and then also to know your options. And if you're curious if schools are test optional or not, you can actually go into their common data set. This is something that you can Google for every college, and it'll tell you whether or not testing is being assessed in the admissions process, or you could just simply Google is X school test optional. So all of that stuff's out there. Margaret, anything to add about testing?
No, I think that was great. I know a lot of students have testing anxiety.
Yeah.
Some students have learning differences that preclude them from really excelling on tests. I would just add that to kind of the context block of, you know, if a student has some challenges that are presented, especially in a standardized testing format, there is a block on the common application that says, is there anything else we need to know? That's a place where you can offer more insight into kind of how a student's brain works, or a school counselor or a student's teacher can offer more insight. But if you do have kind of that going through your brain of like, testing's just not going to work for us, there are things you can do to kind of level the playing field, so to speak.
Yeah, there's a bunch of places to add your story in the application, which is great these days. I'm going to talk about one of those in a second here. Let's move on to talking about demonstrated interest. Some colleges care about demonstrated interest and some do not. This is like a hot topic, I think, or always has been. Why bother visiting or doing Zoom calls or sending emails, and what is considered demonstrated interest? I think this is what most families ask us. Important to note that yield affects rankings. What does yield mean in this context? A yield rate is the percentage of students who accept an offer, which makes a difference in rankings. So for these schools that care about the US News and World Report and things like that, they're going to care about the yield rate. Colleges that track demonstrated interest rarely admit students without any engagement because they want to admit students they think will attend. That's the direct correlation there, the yield rate. Most schools read regionally now. This means that admission reps can focus on a smaller subset of schools, get to know them really well, understand their programs, where they're coming from. I was an admission counselor at Colorado College, like I mentioned, and I did a lot of international recruitment. So I was literally traveling to India and to Korea and to Latin America to visit students in their schools. And then I was reading those applications and I understood the context from which they were coming from because I had actually been in their school. What this means for a student is that they have a contact in the admissions office, so a point person that they can get in touch with and engage with. So if you search online, Pitzer College admissions team, you will find the names of those people and then the states and countries that they evaluate and they travel to. Does a student need to email their admissions representative? And we would say that if a school considers interests, which they do advertise, then yes, it would be a good idea to contact them. The student should, of course, introduce themselves and ask a few questions to start the conversation. when I was in admissions, it didn't happen quite a lot, but I would get emails from students. It was pretty short emails, just basically saying, hi, I'm X student. I go to this high school in this state. I have a few questions about X school. Other times I'd get emails from students saying like, hey, I see that you're coming to my school soon. I'm so excited. I love X school for these reasons. So that was really helpful, especially as someone who worked for small colleges, because then I could recall that person's name and I remember that they reached out to me and they took that time. So if a school does consider demonstrated interest, then yes, we would advise that you reach out to your counselor. How do you know if a school cares about demonstrated interest? Again, I mentioned something called the common data set. I actually just did a blog about this. So I know that if you look up like Pitzer College common data set, you navigate to section C of that. That's going to detail the first year admission data, and you'll find a table that represents the relative importance of academic and non-academic factors in relation to the college's admission evaluation process. So level of applicants' interest, it's actually the bottom row of that table there, and it's going to list it from very important to not considered. We recommend consistent communication by a student. We're going to say consistent, not continuous, because you don't want to be annoying. Students can demonstrate interest in tons of ways. So contacting your representative, like we had mentioned, taking an official tour of campus. A lot of students can't tour campus. They don't have the means to fly. I know that was me in high school. Didn't have the means to fly to visit campus. I actually went to Pitzer on day one. So I did not get the chance to visit beforehand, but I would say that if you do not have the opportunity to visit campus, then you should at least attend a virtual information session, or sometimes schools put on these virtual panels of students, things like that. Because of COVID, there's tons of virtual offerings, so taking advantage of that would be great. Colleges track that for the colleges that do track interest. Meet your admission rep when they come to visit your high school, attend an open house, interview with student interviewers. Most interviews are now virtual as well, which is great. So if you don't have the means, again, to travel to campus, then a student could do that virtually. And then a student can also choose to apply early decision. Not all colleges have this, but early decision is a decision plan, as the name suggests, where a student can say, I want to apply to Pitzer ED. And that means if Pitzer takes them, then that student is committing to attend. And then they need to redact their applications at all of the other institutions that they applied to. Of course, that's like the pinnacle of demonstrated interest, and sometimes acceptance rates there can double or even triple. So there's a lot of different ways to engage with interest. It's just important to do it for the colleges that care about it. Pitzer does consider it. The UCs do not. Just a few examples there. So it's just important to know where colleges stand. Margaret, did I cover everything you were thinking about for demonstrated interest?
You did. I think if you're listening to this and your head is swimming, that's normal. I always make a lot of charts for folks that we work with of like, okay, these schools offer early action, early decision, regular decision enrolling, and then like check off the one that you want and put the deadline by it, so that there's plenty of organization to be had. Mattie is so good at that. I've learned a lot from her. But if your head is swimming with all of these words that college admissions folks use, that I think that's a normal response. But there are ways to organize it, and we're going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. All right, our next slide. We've got a few more here. Data reads are increasingly popular. What does that mean? This is not an entirely new concept, but admissions is reactionary. And I'm sure there's some of you on this call who remember when schools would tell you that you need a certain GPA or test score to get into college. And internationally, that's still very much the case. We do work with some students that are applying to, say, the UK schools, and we know that data because of that. And the move to returning to a process in which GPA and testing were evaluated before anything else was happening before COVID, but the coronavirus definitely acted as an accelerant. So suddenly large flagship schools became much more popular. Students wanted to stay closer to home, both for safety and because they couldn't visit out-of-state colleges. Other factors that increased applications included high school graduates. We had more high school graduates in general as a country. An increase in targeted recruitment by admission offices. There were rankings in the media calling attention to top colleges. We, have an ease of the application process now by things called the common application. Some schools were eliminating their supplemental essays or their application fees. And of course, the test optional environment caused this increase of applications. So why does evaluating GPA and test scores help an admission office? Well, the real question is, who reads all of these additional applications? Suddenly we have 20,000 more applications because we're test optional at Harvard, whatever that is. Unfortunately, admissions offices typically run on a shoestring budget, and there's a massive amount of turnover in the admissions world, primarily with the young professionals. And then in addition to that, addition to salaried employees, offices are generally contracting outside readers, but it's expensive to do that. So now we have a surplus of applications. How do we get through this in time to release decisions by a certain date? Colleges use cutoffs to expedite the reading cycle and reduce essentially inundation of applications per reader. There generally isn't a standardized way that colleges will have cutoffs, and some are open to talking about it while others are not. I live in Southern Colorado, and our regional institution here, they say you need this test score and this GPA to get in. Some like Auburn University, they'll say that you need a 3.6 GPA in order to be test optional, but they won't tell you what GPA you need to automatically get in. We find that most schools will publish a middle 50% instead of cutoffs. And additionally, this method is often skewed when it comes to creating a diverse class, which is why many schools don't use minimum GPAs or test scores. In relation to this, we often get asked, for schools who are driven by data, why do they still ask for the essays? Some students can move into the class simply by data, but those that are on the border are often evaluated by their essays to help the reader or the committee make a final decision. Colorado College, that's my most recent institution, is why I keep mentioning them. We definitely did that. So we had these, top scorers and top performers in the classroom. We were admitting them after the first read, they were instantly in the class. And then we had these students with maybe lower grades or lower test scores. Those were the ones that were in the committee room. So us admission counselors, we were then charged with preparing speeches that we were going to give for all of the other admission counselors. And we would then go through our students' file, read the personal statement again, read the supplemental essays, type up a speech about those things, and then present them for the committee. And then the committee would vote, should we take this student or not? And every single year that I've been in admissions, there was always one person that would cry. And the reason they were crying was because of what the student wrote about in the essays. So if that goes to show anything, your story is quite important in this process. So even though data reads are increasingly popular in a post-COVID world, the essay in your story is also something that's equally as important these days too. That's it for me on this slide. Margaret, anything else to add?
I hope that the essay piece is encouraging to folks. I love the essay piece. Like, my degree is in rhetoric, basically. I did all of my thesis work on rhetoric. So, I could talk about essays all day long, but I think there's some real fun to be had in writing the essays, and humor is welcome. If your kiddo is funny, let them be funny. I think some of the best essays I read would make me laugh out loud, and not, with inappropriate teenage humor, but just like good, clean humor was always fun. So I think, let your kid be your kid in the essay. Don't worry too much about it being like the perfect college topic. It doesn't need to be, just let them be. We spend a lot of time brainstorming with students and kind of pulling ideas out of them. And we talk about like childhood stories and nicknames and, things that their siblings do that drive them crazy. It's supposed to be fun. So I think really let your kiddo think big and deep, because it's meant to be a reflection of their personality.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to say, I often encourage students to be vulnerable. And a lot of people think that means you need to have this like deep, harrowing story to talk about and share with the admissions committee. And I think that is definitely not the case for everybody. You can show vulnerability in other ways. You can talk about like what makes you a nerd if you feel like you're a nerd. I still remember essays I've read that I really enjoyed from like students with quirks. There was a student that I remember reading at Pitzer that grew up in a circus family, and that was like a cool thing for us in the committee room to talk about. I know I read an essay from a student that was like obsessed with their shoes and had them all color coordinated. another student that wrote about their time working in McDonald's and how it taught them a lot about other people. So I think there's obviously no right answer on what to write about. But as Margaret said, yeah, letting the student be themselves and telling that authentic, vulnerable story, I think is important for the essays. Thank you, Margaret. I have one more slide here, and then Margaret's gonna read the last slide or take us home. Institutional priorities matter. So as mentioned before, colleges are garnering more applications than ever before, which has allowed them to be highly strategic in shaping its student body based on its priorities and preferences. There's so many different types of institutions out there: public, independent, coeducational, single sex, religious, secular, technical, comprehensive, liberal arts, progressive, traditional. There's so many different types, and every college has its own history and mission. Then it's up to the admission office to maintain enrollment based on the directives that are often articulated by the trustees and the administration, which is why a college periodically writes something called a strategic plan to make these commitments and priorities clear and actionable. So a student can clearly, or obviously, learn about these by Googling as they do. You can look up a college's history, their mission, their values, their strategic plan. Sometimes even on the admissions website, they'll detail how what they care about in the evaluation process. And then you can see what language they use to describe themselves. And colleges generally look for students who match their values, because those students are most likely to enroll and be happy and graduate and be loyal alumni. And students can do this in a bunch of different ways to show alignment with the college through their writing, their activities lists, their supplemental essays. There's a bunch of ways to talk about those things. This is also where institutional needs and priorities come into play within the admissions process. It's a laundry list of requirements and talents and qualities and preferences that admission offices need to honor as they recruit and admit students. And we've included some here on this slide. These are just examples. I wanted to add here that being a full pay family, full pay means that a student can afford the full tuition, actually the full cost of attendance, which also includes room and board. It's only considered at colleges that are need aware, which means that the college has a limited financial aid budget and therefore cannot admit whoever they see fit without consideration of finances. In addition to these priorities listed here, a college might prioritize students who, let's say, are applying to under-enrolled or new academic programs, or faculty and staff children, or students with developmental potential whose parents might donate to the school, for instance. Students with special artistic talents. I just made the circus reference. This was one where I was like, yeah, this quirkiness belongs at a place like Pitzer. So there are these things that are sort of dictated elsewhere in the institution, and then the admissions office is looked at to enroll students that meet that criteria. What's important to note here is that a majority of these priorities are completely out of a student's control. They change over time, and they only hold a lot of weight at selective colleges and not most colleges. And they additionally don't define a student. And I also want students to know that if they don't have a hook, they should still apply to the college, especially if they feel like the school is a great fit for them, their goals, their academic qualifications, their family's budget. It was actually, so going back to Pitzer, it was really fun to read for a place like Pitzer because of the core values. And I had a great time reading stories from students and seeing what core value they would fit into. And I'll also mention that we had students that had great grades or amazing testing, and we would still waitlist them or deny them if they didn't align with any of our core values. So if we're sitting there like, yikes, the student didn't do any community service in high school, the student wasn't part of a protest or whatever it was, of course, that's not true of every Pitzer student, but they had to align with at least one of the core values in order to get admitted. That's what we're talking about here. So even if you don't have a hook, as long as you align with the ethos of the institution that you're looking to apply to, that's going to be enough of a hook for them. And yeah, majority students, they don't have the advantage of this. And also some other ways to take advantage of this, of course, as I mentioned, alignment with the values, applying early, demonstrating interest, interviewing, demonstrating what you know of a school in the supplemental essays. That's an important one. And then, yeah, cultivating an application that reflects these values of the institution is a big one too. So all the things we talk about at College Solutions and in the college admissions world. Anything else on this one, Margaret? And then we have you talking about the last slide.
I think the only thing I would add is about interviewing. I think a lot of students are scared of that word because they're not used to talking about themselves in a like one-on-one spoken word fashion. Like if we were texting an interview, it would be super cool, but we're not there yet. So I think helping your kids learn how to talk about themselves with adults or college-aged kids is really useful. I teach the triangle philosophy of an interview where a student has kind of three main points about themselves, their application, and then they use each response in the interview to relate back to one of those points. It's a rhetorical skill, but it works. So if you, the parent, aren't going to teach them how to interview, like maybe pull in a college kid friend or a peer who has a similar job or someone as an adult friend, and just let your kid kind of start learning how to talk about themselves, because it is something when you sit down with someone and they say, tell me about yourself, most students want to throw up. So I think the more tools that you can give them, even if it's just the triangle method, I would encourage that.
Thank you. And Margaret, back to you.
Oh, last thing. I would say don't freak out. I mean, yes, this is a very important decision and it's kind of your child's first life decision, and that's exciting and stressful, but just like one step at a time. You're not applying tomorrow, you are gathering information, you're learning about different colleges out there. I love a good spreadsheet. I believe in a spreadsheet for this process, but start early and find appropriate sources of information. I think a lot of parents can get stuck on College Confidential and Reddit and like the parent texting circuit of like, so-and-so's kid got into blank school and they only took this many APs and what. Try to keep the noise down, and find people who study this for a living or talk to your student's school counselor, but try to find helpful, realistic sources of information and not just anxiety. And then the merit A piece is something I'm really passionate about just because I went to college on a merit scholarship with Coca-Cola, so I can never drink Pepsi, I think, ever in my whole life. But merit scholarships are not necessarily all given from the institution. There are private kind of foundation level scholarships, Dell, Microsoft, Coke, the Elks Foundation. A lot of pharmacies have them now. New York Life has one. So there's a ton of merit scholarships out there for lots of different kinds of students, students in technology, students in art, students who are just like good kids who try to do the right thing. So don't just look at the institution side. Look around. There's not great search engines out there right now. I spend a lot of time kind of combing through not so great scholarships to find ones that I think are beefy enough for our students. But that's another place you could start early and start kind of finding ones that fit your kiddos.
Great. We have a few questions that have come
Mhm.
through. So we are going to end today by answering your questions. Thank you for those who posed them. Margaret, I was hoping you could answer this one. It's about curriculum. So this person is wondering about taking things like taking stats at a local college this summer rather than taking honor stats followed by the AP exam next year, for an advanced student who took calculus in 9th grade. That's an interesting.
Cool. Advanced calculus in 9th grade,
Yeah,
like the nerd in me is so excited. I mean, I always think college level classes are a good idea if it's a good fit for the student academically. I think the question, it sounds like, and Mattie, correct me, is if they don't have the AP credit, is that a concern?
Yeah, I think it's one versus the other. So taking stats at a local college this summer rather than taking honor stats followed by the AP exam. I think,
see.
yeah, I think you answered, some of that, but maybe like AP classes versus, or honors classes versus maybe taking it at a local institution.
this is a tricky one, right? Because there are some, usually math students, who max out of math at the high school level, and they want to take linear and differential and multivariate and all that super cool math that I never took. And that's only offered at the community college. I think that is great because you have a student has gone above and beyond to maximize the rigor of their curriculum. And curriculum, I'm not going to say it's a silver bullet, but if you take really hard classes, colleges pay attention. The difference, though, is when there is an AP or an IB level class offered at the high school and a dual enrollment class offered at the community college. I always reply this to English because words are my thing, and that's what my degree is in. But if an AP or an IB English class is offered at the high school and then it's also offered at the dual enrollment level, I get nervous about the dual enrollment class. And the reason is typically a syllabus of that class does not accompany a college application. So as someone who's reading an application can look at that and think, did they watch movies? Did they write research papers? I have no idea. Whereas with an AP or an IB English class, those of us who work in higher education kind of understand the regimented rubric of a composition or a literature class. So I get nervous when it's like you can't really explain it, explain why there's a differential between the college level class and the high school level class. But if you've maxed out at the high school level and just need to go to community college because there's nothing left, super cool. You should go for it.
Great. There was another question that came through in the same vein of curriculum. It looks like this person has 2 kids that are advanced in math, and they'll run out of math curriculum at their high school.
Love it.
They're taking classes at a local college. Their school's schedule and their extracurriculars, it'll be hard for them to take synchronous classes.
Yep.
And she knows, or he knows, of some professors who are willing to do independent studies with them, which means that it'll show up on their transcript as RNC multivariable calculus rather than math 253 multivariable calculus. And do we think this matters? My first thought is no, it wouldn't matter. I mean, if the student's getting to multivariable calculus and they've maximized their math curriculum in high school, it shouldn't matter. What do you think, Margaret?
Totally agree. Like super cool. I love numbers, people. My question is, what does it look like in the GPA? Because sometimes when you take an outside class or something outside of the context of the high school, that grade is not factored into the GPA, which may be a good thing, or it may not be a good thing. But I think on the parent level, you want to find out, what does it say on the transcript precisely when your child applies to college, and does that grade get factored into the GPA?
Yeah, that's great. One person here wondered, what factor does being a Native American or first generation student play into the admission process at universities in Pitzer? So I think this correlates to what happened recently with affirmative action in the Supreme Court. Race is no longer a factor that can be intentionally considered in the college admissions process. We know that. The full implications of this, including how it affects students applying in this current admission cycle and the future cycles, that's still unclear. In terms of being a first generation student, again, we touched a little bit on this with the institutional priorities. I think if that's a priority for the college to enroll first generation students, then that's certainly going to be something that they consider when they're reviewing applications. I'll also mention this too about race. Although colleges are no longer able to have the checkbox that says a student is of a certain racial or ethnic background, they're still allowed to consider race as it relates to a student's personal narrative and their experiences. So yes, that's important to note what this means for the student. If they do want this to be considered as part of their application, they can write about it somewhere in there. At least for now, we haven't heard anything else yet. This could be as central as writing your personal statement about your identity, or even incorporating it in their activities list. Some students don't want to spend their entire application focusing on ethnicity, race, in which case, if you do still want it to be, an integral part of your application, there are, as Margaret was saying, there are other places to input this information. Specifically, there's an additional information section on the common application, actually in most applications, a 650 word space where students can go ahead and then talk about their background and hopefully celebrate their background too. That's what colleges want to see. They want to admit students that are, complex humans. So utilizing that space for that reason would be good. So yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think what's going to end up happening, because the Supreme Court ruled in this way, is that many colleges are going to increase their outreach in communities of color and rural areas. That's going to be a big thing. And Towson University is a good example of this. Don't ask me why I know this. Us counselors just have random information in our head about college admissions, but they of course don't use race as a factor in admission decisions anymore, as they can't. But they've implemented other strategies. So they of course, they're test optional. They focus their outreach in certain areas of the state, like Baltimore. They're in Maryland. They spend about 50% of their aid on need-based grants, and then they have resources in place to help with the college transition process. So we're going to see some changes, I think, in what happens because of this decision. But I think admission offices are always looking for ways that they can improve their process based on what's going on with the Supreme Court. And like I had mentioned, I think what's important here in regards to your question is just that please know that you can still integrate your story and your background into your application that goes beyond just the data checkbox.
Mhm.
So that was one of our questions here. And then Margaret, yes, merit scholarships.
Oh, yeah.
Back to you. You had mentioned that there aren't many great search engines for finding merit scholarships. Someone asked if you can suggest a couple to try.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, the kind of end all be all, most comprehensive is a website called fastweb.com. FASTWEB as in boy. You will get a lot of spam as soon as you sign up, but it is a searchable database. So I would start there. There's another program called Scholly, SCHOLLY. They just got bought out by a larger firm, but they're pretty good about letting you put in kind of your credentials and then pulling a list based on that. And then the other one I like based on kind of region is the College Aid Pro, CAP. I always want to call it Center for American Progress because that's who I used to write for, not the same thing. College Aid Pro, they have a scholarship database. You have to pay for it, which is annoying, but they do have some pretty good stuff that Google may not lead you to, in a direct fashion. Just other tips is that typically most kind of localities have a community foundation. They call it different things, but if you look up kind of your locality and the words community foundation, sometimes that will kind of open up a door. Pharmacies, as I mentioned before, for some reason, pharmacies set aside money for high school students, and it's kind of just whoever applies, which is great. And then the other is law firms, local law firms. For some reason, they typically are like personal injury law firms. I have found kind of across the United States have money for high school students entering first year of college. And then if you belong to any professional associations as a parent, sometimes they have money set aside for high school students. Random things I know, but as someone who was desperate to find kind of free money for college, I certainly kind of could have used that advice when I was looking for them.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for your questions. We have a bit more time in this session, so if you have anything else that's coming to mind, please post that in the questions box or the Q&A box. Justin, I don't live near Pitzer now, so this goes to you. Do you still have In-N-Out Burger near Pitzer College? When I was there was still one in the Inland Empire, so I assume it's still there. But yeah, maybe that's a
Yes.
Justin response.
Yes. There's no drive-throughs in Claremont, so you can't go into Claremont and get an In-N-Out Burger, but you can go either way. So I definitely have gone there to the Upland one on lunch break occasionally.
Great. Now we know. Great. I'm not seeing any other questions come through. We are going to send a follow-up. Oh, okay. Could you repeat? Actually, let's go. We've got a question here. Okay. Could you repeat the scholarship search ideas one more time or put them in the chat? Margaret, up to you on this one.
Yes. So I have to remember all the ones I told you.
Yeah, yeah.
Fast Web, so FASTWEB, College Aid Pro, CAP, and Scholly, SCHOLLY. And then the other kind of general tips were professional associations, pharmacies, personal injury law firms. I think that was all. Oh, and community foundations.
Great. This person asked about any important FAFSA advice. The only thing that's coming to mind right now is make sure you apply for financial aid on time.
Yeah.
So be aware of the deadlines. They're on the admissions website. Get the FAFSA in on time, and then also know that for private institutions like Pitzer or any of the Claremonts, you do need to also fill out something called the CSS profile. And that's another way that schools use. It's another form that colleges use to assess a family's financial situation. For a place like Pitzer that meets full demonstrated financial need, that's how they're getting how much financial need a student actually needs. Or yeah, how much aid a student actually needs. So it's important to just make sure that you're thinking about the FAFSA and the CSS profile if applying to independent institutions. Any other FAFSA advice, Margaret?
No, I think that's it. I would also say that some schools do what I call first come, first serve with financial aid. So getting it in on time usually increases your chances of getting some more gift aid, or free money, not loans. So just stay on top of the deadline, like Mattie said.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here. Thank you all for submitting your questions. What advice do you have for kids who are very gifted but underachieved in high school, for helping colleges see their potential?
Ooh, it's
A
a
good
good
one.
one.
The first thing that comes to mind is it depends on what colleges they're looking at and how selective they are.
Mhm.
I think it's important for students to be realistic about their college list. So if a student is maybe a C student, they probably shouldn't apply to an Ivy League or University of Chicago, for instance. I mean, they can, but yeah, I think there needs to be a correlation between grades and the schools that they're looking at. And then I think also just utilizing things like the personal statement to tell their story would be a good idea. Demonstrating interest, like actually making a contact with that school, talking to their admission counselor, sort of getting their story across in other ways. I've worked at selective institutions where we've taken students with lower grades and test scores because we really liked who they were as a person. And we were able to collect that information through maybe an interview, which again, I mentioned is virtual nowadays, which means they're easily accessible. So you can jump on a Zoom with a student that currently attends that institution or an admission counselor, depending on how they do it, and really start to tell your story. So I think for that gifted person, as mentioned here in this question, they should really utilize demonstrated interest and then also cultivating a good personal statement. Anything else, Margaret, on that one?
No, I love those ideas. I think I have worked with enough students. I've been an independent now for about 10 or 11 years. I've worked with a lot of students who just kind of wake up one day and realize like, oh yeah, I want to go to college. Sometimes I have seen students take a gap year. I'm a firm believer in gap years and can talk for a long time about them. So if you have questions, please ask. But there are certain kind of things you need to do in a gap year in order for it to be viable. You can't just, go to Europe and backpack like that. That's not a gap year. That's a vacation. So I'm a firm believer in gap years. I'm also a firm believer in the community college system. A lot of states have guaranteed agreements with community colleges where if you take a certain number of credits and you earn a B or a B minus average, you're guaranteed admission to the top to the state's public institutions that are four-year schools. At least in Virginia, we have that agreement. I know in Texas they do, in Georgia they do, where you take, I want to say it's 16 credits and you get a B minus average and you are guaranteed admission to all of the public universities in Virginia. So if a student just needs kind of a longer on-ramp, I guess is what I would call it. Gap years are cool, and I firmly believe in community college or even vocational school too.
Great. I didn't even think about gap year. That's perfect. This is funny. One of the questions asked, do universities ever look at a student's social media websites or sites? The only example that comes to mind for me is that we had actually someone screenshot somebody's postings on Instagram and they sent them to us in the admissions office, and it was pretty bad. That was the only time that I think engaged with a student's social media presence. I think it's always a good idea for students to know what's out there, that these are often public sites that are accessible. I don't know though if colleges are making a concerted effort to look at these things. Do you, Margaret?
I would just caution you if a student is on the wait list at a certain college. I have known of colleges to look up student social media before offering them a spot off the wait list, because the wait list becomes all about who's going to say yes if we offer them a spot off the wait list. And I have known of colleges to kind of look up the student on Instagram or whatever and see if they've already said like, yay, I'm going to blah, blah school, because that student's not going to say yes off the wait list, probably. So waitlist students, I usually do a pretty good scrub on them, because you want that perception to be pretty positive.
Yeah, totally. There was a question. I know we only have a couple more minutes, so we might not get to all these, but a comprehensive database we can search for college priorities like legacy, admissions, geographic region, demonstrated interest, test optional. I was just gonna make another plug for the common data set again, because that's something that all schools release. So literally look up like, I don't know, Chapman University common data set, and then as I had mentioned, they have a grid there for first year admission data, and it's going to tell you how important specific aspects are in the college admissions process to that specific college. So like demonstrated interest was one of those. The level of applicants' interest is literally stated there, and then it says is that very important to the institution or maybe not even considered. So for instance, the University of California, it's not even considered. Common data set comes to mind for me. Anything else, Margaret?
I would also ask school counselors or, any other kind of higher ed professional. I know when I go visit colleges on behalf of my students, I always ask the admission folks, like, what are you looking for? What do you need? Do you need New Mexico? Do you need Native American? And so I'll tell my students, like, I know they're looking for blank. So I would ask higher ed professionals too, just because this is all we talk about.
Great. I'm aware that we're at the hour, so I think we want to probably close here for respect of everyone's time. There were a couple questions that came through, some in relation to how to start working with one of us counselors at College Solutions, or some steps that a student can take to start early in this process and cultivate themselves and things like that. So I just wanted to make a plug for a lovely email that we are going to send to you after this session. And we are going to include a recording of this webinar. And then we are also going to put our email address there, so you can email us if you're interested in working with College Solutions. And then we also offer a free consultation. So if you want to know, package prices, things like that, the nuances of that, it's free to talk to us and get the conversation started. I also really enjoyed being here and talking to you and answering your questions. Margaret, do you have anything else before we conclude?
I'm good. It was such a nice time, and we love this stuff. So if you just have a question that you want answered, feel free to reach out. We're glad to help you.
Great. Justin, anything else from us before we end?
Yeah, I would just say we're very glad to have both you, Margaret, and Mattie here. We're giving this opportunity for our staff and faculty and alumni to learn about what's happening in college admissions right now. Lots of questions that were asked, and some that have, I'm sure, as they percolate on the information a little bit more, that they will be asked in the future. One of my things that I love about my job is highlighting what cool things alumni are doing in the world, and how we can use what cool things they're doing and help other alumni in the process and connect to Pitzer. So Mattie, it's a cool thing that you're doing, being connected with College Solutions, using your 10+ years in admissions experience. We appreciate how you connected so many of your stories and experience back to Pitzer, both as a college student yourself and as an alum, and as an admissions person at Pitzer. But yeah, really excited to highlight you in this and And Margaret, thanks for being here. Thanks for, all that you guys both do to help people in this process.
Right. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Brooke. Thank you all for being here. Bye.